Nobody stopped. That is the part that will stay with you long after this story ends. Not the twist. Not the tears. Not what happened weeks later when 3 black SUVs pulled into that hospital parking lot. The part that will stay with you is this: on a freezing Tuesday night in Cincinnati, Ohio, with hundreds of people within walking distance, a 73-year-old man collapsed on the pavement and not one person stopped. A man in a wool overcoat glanced down and kept walking. A couple on the other side of the street looked over, whispered something to each other, and turned the corner. A taxi slowed just enough to confirm it wasn't a traffic hazard, then drove away. And Walter lay on that frozen concrete, one hand pressed against his chest, his breathing coming in short broken pulls, completely alone. The city moved around him like water around a stone. Like he wasn't even there. Like his life didn't matter enough to cost anyone 30 seconds. Now ask yourself something before this story goes any further. If that was your father lying on that ground, what would you want a stranger to do? Before we go deeper into this story, drop your city or country in the comments right now. We genuinely read every single one and we love knowing where our community is watching from. And if you are new here, hit that subscribe button so you never miss what we put out next. You are going to want to be here for this one. Carol was 51 years old the night she found Walter. And if you had passed her on that street, you probably would have looked away too. That is not a judgment, that is just the honest truth about how the world treats people who look like Carol looked that night. Worn coat. Scuffed boots with a crack along the left sole. A duffel bag over one shoulder that held almost everything she owned. The kind of face that carries years of exhaustion in a way that no amount of sleep ever fully fixes. She didn't look like a hero. She looked like someone the world had already decided wasn't worth stopping for either. But Carol was not always this person. And that matters deeply to this story, so stay with it. 3 years before that January night, Carol had a life. Not a glamorous one, not a wealthy one, but a real one. A small apartment in Covington, Kentucky, just across the river from Cincinnati. A job she had held for 11 years at a dry-cleaning shop on Madison Avenue owned by a quiet Greek man named Mr. Papadakis who called her the most reliable person he had ever employed. She had a routine. Coffee at 6:15. Work by 7:30. Home by 6. A cat named Pepper who sat on the windowsill every evening waiting for her. She was the kind of woman who put birthday cards in the mail 3 days early and learned the names of her neighbors' children. She wasn't rich. But she was rooted. And for a woman who had grown up cycling through foster homes with a garbage bag for luggage, rooted felt like everything. Then Mr. Papadakis got sick. Cancer. The quiet kind that doesn't announce itself until it has already made its decisions. He fought it for 2 years and then, in the spring of 2019, he closed the shop. Carol understood. She packed her things, hugged him goodbye, and told him she'd be fine. She meant it when she said it. What she didn't know was that one closed door was about to become a collapse she couldn't stop. She applied for 33 jobs over 4 months. Retail. Food service. Warehouse work. Cleaning crews. She had no degree, no car, and a single eviction on her record from 12 years earlier, a mistake made during a period of illness that she had long since moved past, but that background checks kept dragging back into the present like an anchor. Landlords stopped returning her calls. Employers moved on. By October she was behind on rent. By December the eviction notice arrived. She called the county assistant's office and was told there was a waiting list. She called a cousin she hadn't spoken to in years. The cousin was sorry but couldn't help. On a cold Thursday morning in February 2020, Carol carried 2 garbage bags and a duffel bag out of her apartment for the last time. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up and down the street for a long moment. Then she picked up her bags and started walking. She didn't know where. She just walked. The neighbor who had agreed to take Pepper was standing in the doorway when Carol left. Carol stopped, handed the cat over without a word, and then turned and kept walking. She made it half a block before she had to stop and press her back against a brick wall because she couldn't see through the tears. She had lost her job, her home, her savings, and her stability, and the thing that finally broke her was giving away her cat. If that doesn't tell you who Carol was, nothing will. For 3 years she survived. She learned the shelters, which ones were safe, which ones to avoid after dark, which ones locked the doors at 7 and wouldn't let you back in. She knew the church on Reading Road that served hot soup on Wednesdays. She knew which gas stations would let her use the bathroom without making her feel like a criminal for asking. She had learned the invisible architecture of street life, all the unwritten rules, all the quiet indignities, all the ways you learn to make yourself small so the world doesn't notice you. But here is the thing about Carol that nobody walking past her ever saw. She still helped people. Every single chance she got. She shared food when she barely had enough for herself. She walked a sick man named Terrence 3 hours to a free clinic because his foot was infected and he couldn't make the walk alone. She sat with a 20-year-old girl named Destiny on her first night outside and talked her through the fear until morning came. She had nothing, and she kept giving it away. Can you imagine doing that? Can you honestly imagine being at the absolute bottom of your own life and still choosing to show up for someone else? Because that is exactly who Carol was on the night she found Walter. It was 19 degrees. She had just left the shelter on Central Parkway after a disagreement over a bunk assignment, nothing serious, just the kind of friction that happens when too many desperate people share too little space. She wasn't angry. Just tired in a way that lives deeper than the body. She was walking toward a covered alcove on 5th Street where she sometimes slept when she saw a shape near the curb. At first it looked like a bag someone had abandoned. Then it moved. She stopped. Walter was on his side, one hand flat against his chest, the other lying open on the concrete like he had just let go of something. His breathing was shallow and uneven. He was well-dressed, gray wool coat, dark pressed trousers, leather shoes worn at the heel but clearly once expensive. He looked like a man who had once had a name that meant something. His face was pale. His lips had a blue tint that Carol recognized immediately. She had seen it before on the streets. It never meant anything good. She dropped to her knees beside him and pressed 2 fingers against the side of his neck. Pulse there, weak, skipping. She looked up. 3 people passed within arm's reach in under a minute. She stood up and stepped directly in front of a young woman walking fast with earbuds in. Please, I need you to call 911. This man is dying right now. The woman pulled out one earbud and looked at Carol. Then she looked at Walter. Then she looked back at Carol, at the duffel bag, the cracked boots, the worn coat, and she hesitated. That hesitation lasted maybe 4 seconds. But Carol felt every one of them. Please, Carol said again. Quietly. Without anger. Just steady. The woman dialed. While they waited, Carol did something that the paramedics would later mention to the hospital staff, who would later mention it to Walter, who would later tell his son through tears. She took off her coat, her only coat, and laid it over Walter. Then she sat down on the frozen pavement beside him in just a thin gray sweater, her breath coming out in white clouds in the 19-degree air, and she put her hand on his arm so he would know that someone was there. Don't close your eyes, she said. Help is coming. You stay with me. Walter turned his head slowly and looked at her face. His voice came out barely above a breath. Why are you doing this? Carol didn't pause. She didn't think about it. She just said it. Because if I leave, you die. Walter held her gaze for a moment. Then something in his face changed, like a man who had forgotten something important and had just been reminded of it. The ambulance arrived 11 minutes later. Carol stood up, stepped back, and let them work. One paramedic looked at her and asked if she was family. She shook her head. They loaded Walter onto the stretcher. Just before the doors closed, Walter's hand reached slightly outward. Carol watched the ambulance pull into the dark. Then she picked up her duffel bag and walked away. She thought that was the end of it. Walter was admitted to Cincinnati General with a severe cardiac episode. For 2 days he had no ID, no phone, no immediately traceable identity. On the third day a connection was made through a missing persons report filed by a private security detail out of Columbus, Ohio. The calls that followed were swift and serious. On the morning of the fourth day, 3 black SUVs arrived at the hospital. Security personnel in dark jackets moved through the lobby. Staff straightened instinctively without knowing why. And a man named Daniel Mercer, 46 years old, founder of Mercer Capital Group, one of the most powerful private investment firms in the Midwest, walked through those doors and down the hall to room 114. Daniel and his father Walter had been estranged for 6 years. A falling out over the family business, over pride, over the kind of silence that hardens between two people until neither one remembers who was supposed to speak first. Walter had quietly withdrawn from everything after the estrangement. Sold his house. Moved into a small rental. Stopped answering calls. Nobody knew how isolated he had become. Not even Daniel. Until now. Daniel sat beside his father's bed and held his hand. Walter told him everything, the collapse, the people who walked past, and the woman who knelt down in the cold and refused to leave. Daniel listened without a word. When his father finished, his jaw was tight and his eyes were wet. He asked one question. "Do you know her name?" Walter said yes. He had asked the paramedic to write it down before they took him. Just in case. Her name was Carol, but finding her would turn out to be much harder than anyone expected. And what happened after they finally did? Changed everything. It took Daniel's team 4 days to find her. She was at the soup kitchen on Reading Road on a Wednesday afternoon when a woman she didn't know approached and asked if she was Carol and if she had helped an elderly man on 5th Street in January. Carol said yes slowly, the way someone answers when they expect bad news. The woman told her the man's son wanted to meet her and thank her. Carol said she didn't need anything. The woman said she understood completely, but asked if Carol would come anyway. Carol was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. When Carol walked into that hotel lobby on 4th Street, she was still wearing the replacement coat the shelter had given her. The original was still wrapped around Walter somewhere in a hospital storage bag. Daniel stood up from across the room and walked toward her. He reached out his hand. Carol shook it. He looked at her for a moment and then said, "You saved my father's life. And I don't think you have any idea what that means to me." Carol said quietly that she just did what anyone would do. Daniel shook his head. "No," he said. "You did what almost no one did. There is a difference. There was no ceremony. No cameras. No oversized check. Daniel simply asked Carol what she needed most and then he sat down and listened. Within 6 weeks she had a furnished apartment in Covington, the same neighborhood she had been evicted from 3 years before. Daniel connected her with a workforce program and within 3 months she was working part-time at a nonprofit placing homeless women into stable housing. She was sleeping through the night for the first time in years. She got another cat. She named him Walter. Here is what this story leaves you with. Carol did not stop that night because she expected anything in return. She stopped because she looked at a man on the ground and decided his life mattered, even when every single person around her had already decided to keep walking. She had 19 degrees, a thin sweater, a cracked duffel bag, and $1.75. And she gave the only thing she had left. She stayed. So here is the question this story is really asking you. And be honest with yourself when you answer it. On that freezing Tuesday night in Cincinnati, would you have stopped? Or would you have kept walking? Because most of us would like to believe we would stop. But the people who walked past Walter that night, they probably thought the same thing about themselves too. If this story moved you, share it with one person today who needs to be reminded that kindness still exists. Subscribe if you haven't already. And we will see you in the next one.